The protests in Iran that have entered the fourth week are very different from protests that we've seen in the country over the past decade plus. So many will remember the protests following the disputed presidential election in Iran in June 2009, where people came to the streets and said, "Where is my vote?" It was called the Green Movement. It was very organized. A lot of civil society leaders at the time had a role in organizing those protests, and it was concentrated in urban centers in Tehran and other major cities. And ultimately, it was a protest about reform in the system. It was an appeal to the institution. The slogan was, "Where is my vote?" What we see now is very different. Protesters, mostly young people under the age of 25, have taken to the street, and their demand is not an appeal for reform. It is death to the Islamic Republic, death to the dictator. It is very clear that what they're calling for is a wholesale change. There have been recurring protests in the country since December 2017, with shortening spaces between each protest. Some of those protests eventually were eventually spread nationwide and quickly converted into being anti-government in nature, with the slogans being anti-government. But a lot of the sparks for those previous protests had to do with different issues. In November 2019, it was about a sudden removal of subsidies on gas, which resulted in a sudden spike in gas prices. Other protests have been about water shortages in specific provinces, or labor union strikers who have not been getting paid wages. These protests are very different because the initial catalyst was the tragic killing of Masajina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish girl who had been taken into the custody of the morality police and then mysteriously died. And so these protests are really about social change. We see young women, even as young as schoolgirls, as 12, 13, and 14 years old, taking off their mandatory hijab and demanding a change. So this protest is solely, is at its core about changing social mores within the Islamic Republic, strikes to the core of the Islamic Republic's ideology, and is asking for a change. And it's youth-led and women-driven.